Judge outraged as Kash Patel claims Diddy assaulted Eddie's 17-year-old daughter. The lights in the courtroom were too bright, not harsh, but clinical. Eddie Murphy sat still, his suit crisp, his hands folded neatly, his eyes focused ahead. But behind that calm facade was a man who had waited years for this moment. Not to exact revenge, but to tell the truth. He hadn't spoken publicly in years, not about this. But now the silence has become unbearable. The rumors, the whispers, the lies, they had nearly swallowed his legacy. And worse, they had targeted his family. Eddie began slowly. "I was invited once," he said, "to what they called the White Party." A hush swept the room. Everyone knew what that meant, even if no one ever said it out loud. Not just a party, a ritual, a test. Back in 2006, Eddie had been riding a second wave of career success. Offers were pouring in. Studios wanted him. Everyone wanted him. Until he received the invitation. It came in a white envelope, he said, his voice steady. No return address. Just one sentence inside, "Come see the truth." At first he thought it was a joke, but the call came next from someone powerful. A producer with ties to everyone and everything. The man simply said, "You're in, if you want to be." Eddie went. Curiosity, maybe, or pride, or a desire to finally understand what he'd always suspected. The mansion in the hills had no signs. The gate opened silently. Valets in black took his phone. No cameras, no questions. Inside, everything was immaculate, cold, calculated. Like a museum of power, Eddie said. But the art wasn't on the walls. He walked through rooms full of faces he recognized. Big names, smiling too wide. Eyes that didn't match their grins. People playing a part in something they couldn't fully escape. And then came Diddy. He greeted me like an old friend, Eddie said. Put his arm around me. Told me it's time to stop being a visitor. Time to be family. At first it sounded harmless. But Diddy wasn't talking about camaraderie. He was talking about compliance. He led me down a hallway, Eddie continued. Stopped at a door, said, "This is where the choices get made. You want to stay funny and broke, or you want to rise." Behind that door was something Eddie never described in full. What I saw, he said, pausing, wasn't a party. It was a performance. And not everyone walked out the same. He left that night, politely, calmly. Told Diddy he wasn't feeling well. Diddy smiled and said, "You'll be back. They always come back." But Eddie didn't. That choice cost him. Projects dried up. Calls stopped. People he'd worked with for years suddenly became unavailable. They didn't have to blacklist me, he said. They just stopped opening doors. Then the pressure grew darker. Whispers about him started. Stories planted. But Eddie remained silent until it wasn't just about him anymore. Because someone else received the invitation. Bella, his daughter, his little girl. She was 17, he said, voice breaking. She told me she was going to a friend's party. We trusted her. Why wouldn't we? But Bella didn't come back the same. She became withdrawn, quiet. And one night Eddie found the same kind of envelope he had once received hidden in her room. Same white card, same words. Bella eventually told him. Not everything, but enough. She said there were rooms, locked ones, and people she didn't know called her by name. They said if she left, we'd all pay the price. That was the moment Eddie realized he hadn't just escaped. He'd left others behind, including his own child. Now in court, he wasn't just a witness. He was a father, and this time he wasn't leaving quietly. In the weeks following his devastating testimony, Eddie Murphy tried to return to normalcy. But something had shifted, not just in the courtroom, not just in the press. Something much closer. Something at home. Bella had changed. His fourth child, born in 2008, had always been vibrant, curious, a girl with the kind of laugh that echoed through walls. But now she has grown quiet, withdrawn. The sparkle in her eyes dimmed like a curtain had fallen over the sun. Eddie noticed the signs: early unusual absences, unspoken tension, late-night calls that stopped when he entered the room. When he asked, she assured him everything was fine. Just school, she'd say. Hanging with friends. But Eddie had been in the game too long not to recognize the deflection. The truth hit harder than any tabloid headline. It came in the form of a small white envelope, no return address. Just her name printed in looping cursive: Bella Murphy. Inside was a note unsigned: "You are invited. The White Gathering. Be who you truly are." His blood froze. That phrase. He'd seen it once before. It had been handed to him nearly 2 decades earlier, outside that estate in the hills. It wasn't an invitation. It was a trap. Bella had gone. Alone. She hadn't told anyone. Eddie confronted her days later. At first she denied it. Then the tears came. Then the truth. She had received the note weeks before delivered through a friend of a friend at an elite acting workshop. She thought it was an opportunity, perhaps even an audition. She didn't know. Not at first. What she walked into was eerily familiar. A remote location. Phones surrendered. No photos, no questions. The room was lavish but unsettling, filled with people twice her age. Some smiled too much. Others didn't smile at all. Bella had tried to leave once. She said it was when the conversations turned from casual to coercive. She felt eyes on her every move. She made for the exit. That's when the whispers began. "They know your father talked," someone said. "They know he left the table." Then the threat came. "If you leave, they don't just come for you. They come for your family." She stayed, not because she wanted to, because she was afraid. She went back, not once, several times, always under different pretenses. Study group, birthday gathering, industry mixer. But each time the pattern was the same: the note, the car, the gathering, and always the same man lingering just behind the curtain of the elite Diddy. Eddie didn't scream when she told him. He didn't cry. He simply walked out of the room into the garage and screamed into the steering wheel until his voice cracked. Now it wasn't just about his career. It wasn't about pride. It was about blood, family, his daughter. He returned to court this time with more than a story. He brought evidence: emails, voicemails, anonymous tips, hidden recordings Bella had managed to capture, and worse, digital files Eddie himself had buried in fear years earlier. Proof of his own extortion, photos, transactions. Moments from the white parties that had been used as leverage to exile him quietly from Hollywood. He had kept it all, not because he was planning revenge, but because something in him had refused to forget. The courtroom was no longer the battleground. It was the reckoning. Pam Bondi, now aiding as a public advocate, sat by Bella's side as the young woman prepared to speak, but she couldn't. Not yet. The trauma was too fresh. Kash Patel stepped in to do what Eddie couldn't: lay out the pattern, show the network, connect the dots. He made it clear that this wasn't a story of one bad party or one manipulative celebrity. This was a system, with layers, gatekeepers, enforcers, enablers. And it began with Diddy. He was the connector, the figure behind the curtain, the one who ensured silence through fear, through shame, through the illusion of opportunity. He didn't just silence people with money, Kash said. He did it with memory, with guilt, with favors you couldn't return. Bella's testimony was submitted in the form of a statement, signed, notarized, protected under seal for her safety. But its existence shook the courtroom. For the first time, a second generation and innocent had been pulled into the shadows. Diddy's lawyers protested, called it hearsay, claimed Bella was coached, her memory unreliable. They mocked the note, the invitation. They accused Eddie of weaponizing parenthood to gain sympathy, but Eddie had more: flight records, security footage. A black car registered under a Shell LLC appeared at Bella's high school on 3 separate occasions within a week of the party. Bella had written down everything she remembered: who spoke to her, who gave her the note, what was said, One name repeated more than once: Sean Combs. The court gasped, not at the name itself, but at the frequency, the sheer arrogance, as if Diddy no longer felt the need to hide. Eddie sat back down, exhausted. He didn't want revenge. He wanted release. He looked toward his daughter, now shielded by federal protection. Her eyes no longer dim, but defiant. The judge paused. "We will reconvene, but let me be clear, what has been presented goes beyond the scope of celebrity misconduct. This may trigger broader criminal inquiry." As the gavel struck, the room fell silent. Outside, the world wasn't watching a trial anymore. It was witnessing a collapse. The aftermath of Eddie Murphy's courtroom return was like a bolt of lightning splitting Hollywood down its spine. For a moment, silence took over. Not just in the press, but inside boardrooms, behind velvet ropes, inside the network of handlers and PR fixers, who had for years kept secrets buried beneath glossy headlines. Now they were scrambling. It wasn't just the allegations, it was the documentation, the flight records, the digital traces. Bella's notarized testimony, protected under federal seal, sent shockwaves across the entertainment landscape. Eddie had cracked open something far more terrifying than a scandal. He had exposed the system. The response from Diddy's team was swift and brutal. Through carefully worded statements, they painted Eddie as a grieving has-been exploiting his daughter's trauma for public sympathy. Rumors were fed to tabloid circuits implying Bella was unstable, that the recordings were fabricated, that the note was part of an elaborate hoax. But behind closed doors, it wasn't bravado. I panicked. Kash Patel, now acting as special prosecutor, began issuing formal subpoenas to parties who had been named by Bella or identified through digital forensics. Private investigators working with Patel's office traced financial records tied to shell corporations that owned the transport services involved in moving guests to and from the white gatherings. A pattern emerged: repeat locations, consistent security companies, and a list of names who appeared at multiple events. Some were actors. Some were producers. Some were former politicians. Others were anonymous, identified only by pseudonyms. And yet each time a subpoena was issued, a new leak emerged. A slanted article, a source close to the family, a publicist spreading disinformation. The machine had gone into overdrive. Pam Bondi, now embedded with the Department of Justice's Special Investigative Unit, held a press conference to calm growing speculation. "This is not a trial of entertainment," she said firmly. "This is a matter of coercion, of corruption, and potentially of trafficking." The media responded unevenly. Conservative outlets lauded Eddie's bravery. Some liberal voices cautiously avoided the topic altogether. Others mocked it, calling it a distraction from more important cases. But the silence of former colleagues was perhaps the most damning. Friends Eddie had worked with for decades quiet. Networks that once begged for his appearance silent. Agencies that once packaged his projects radio silent. That's when it became clear. It wasn't that they doubted him, they feared they might be next. More names began surfacing, buried in old emails, calendar invites, receipts. One in particular shocked even Kash Patel. A confidential memo from 2016 marked "private audience" at a Malibu estate tied to Diddy. The guest list. Over a dozen familiar faces, including a young Bella Murphy listed under an alias. She was only 8 years old at the time. Eddie, upon seeing the document, had to leave the room. His lawyer took over. As pressure built, a few insiders finally broke ranks. One was a former assistant. She described the white rooms as places of psychological manipulation, carefully curated atmospheres, where guests were primed to submit, to agree, to fall in line. Another was a driver who transported dozens of guests to events. He detailed silent agreements routes, chosen to avoid surveillance, and routine cash envelopes exchanged without signature. More damning, however, were the surveillance tapes. One of them had been hidden in Eddie's own garage, buried inside an old guitar amplifier. It was from 2008, the same year Bella was born. It showed a gathering, a familiar foyer, Faces blurred, but voices clear. Diddy's unmistakably so. They either belong to us, or they vanish. That clip, just 9 seconds long, was authenticated by forensic audio specialists. It couldn't be dismissed. It couldn't be buried. The FBI joined the investigation. Suddenly, agents began visiting sets, issuing quiet subpoenas, asking polite, persistent questions. Behind every polite knock was a sense of finality. The industry began to sweat. Eddie remained mostly at home. He gave no interviews. He didn't tweet. He simply waited. Bella, meanwhile, was undergoing trauma counseling her sessions supervised by professionals appointed by the DOJ. Despite the weight she carried, her words in private became sharper, more focused. She began writing, journaling, documenting what had happened in her own voice. Not just what she saw, but what she felt. They made it feel like if I didn't smile, my family would disappear. Kash Patel read that line aloud in court during a sealed session. Those in the room said it left the air cold. A new wave of victims came forward, quietly, carefully. Their stories varied in detail but echoed in structure. Some were men, some were women. All of them described the same thing: an invitation, a party, a secret, a price. The case now had multiple branches. One focused on extortion, another on coercion, a third, most damningly, on trafficking minors. Pam Bondi began working with international legal teams. Diddy's overseas properties were flagged. Multiple countries placed travel restrictions on his entourage. He could no longer run, and still Hollywood said almost nothing. But the public was watching. Online, a movement grew. The hashtags were relentless. Believe Bella, Outraged exposed the machine. Murphy was right. Protesters appeared outside old studio gates, demanding transparency. Eddie sat quietly, often beside Bella, reviewing documents, listening to Kash, staying silent in public, but roaring in evidence. In private, he whispered to his daughter, "They tried to erase us, but you're the ink." Bella smiled, for the first time in months. Eddie Murphy had opened the vault of silence, but he knew that speaking wasn't enough. This wasn't just about him, or even about Bella. It was about a system so entrenched, so deeply corrupted, that truth alone could not dismantle it. Yet every step forward meant exposing more of his wounds, and more of the mechanisms used by Diddy and his silent enablers. When Eddie took the stand again, the room was more tense than ever. The silence had matured, not out of respect, but out of dread. What else could possibly be revealed? The moment Bella came home, shaking and silent, Eddie began, "I knew something had gone terribly wrong, but she didn't say anything, not for days." He explained how the invitation had come. It was clean, elegant, embossed paper with only 2 words, "White Party." At the time I thought maybe it was a coincidence, but the more I asked, the less she answered. Bella at 14 had been promised stardom, something about a casting opportunity, an acting class, hosted by Hollywood elites. She thought it was a way to honor her father's legacy. Instead, she entered a space designed to break spirits. Eddie revealed that Bella had admitted to being at a mansion similar to the one Eddie had fled years ago. She said everyone smiled too much, but their eyes were wrong, he said. He paused. She told me a woman whispered to her, "Just smile. Everything else will pass." The courtroom leaned in. Kash Patel, now clearly the prosecutor pulling the strings, nodded solemnly. Pam Bondi, seated next to Bella in the gallery, offered a subtle nod of encouragement. Murphy testified that Bella eventually confided about being escorted to rooms she didn't understand, with people she didn't know, and asked to just stay still. She had tried to leave once, but a tall man blocked her way and whispered something about her family. She told me, he said, "Your dad was funny. Don't make us rewrite that legacy." The crowd was stunned. Eddie's voice cracked for the first time. That was when I knew. It wasn't just a vendetta against me. They were sending a message. He handed the judge a sealed folder. Inside were documents, screenshots, even short video clips. footage of Bella being escorted in and out of high-security buildings, notes sent anonymously to their home. They made sure we knew, he said, not with threats but with reminders that they were always close. At this point, Diddy stared at Eddie emotionless. His lawyers whispered frantically. Eddie recounted the attempt to confront Diddy directly. I showed up at one of his public events. I wasn't invited. I didn't care. I shouted his name. He didn't look at me, but he sent someone. That same night I received an email. No words, just a single image of Bella leaving school. Murphy stopped and shook his head. That's when I knew I was dealing with something far beyond showbiz. Kash Patel presented a timeline next. It detailed Diddy's known associations' travel records and private flight logs. One name recurred: Bella Murphy. There were photographs, some blurry, others hauntingly clear, showing Bella at functions she never mentioned to Eddie. He explained she was often told these events were just social mixers or industry dinners. But patterns emerged. So did other teens, other rising stars. It was a grooming ring, Eddie said bluntly, wrapped in glamour, sealed with silence. Pam Bondi supported this testimony with legal documentation. These aren't isolated incidents, she said. They form a pattern of exploitation masked as opportunity. The prosecution produced a letter. Diddy's signature was absent, but its tone was unmistakably his. Stars shine brightest in the darkest rooms. The letter had been found in Bella's old purse. She had never mentioned it. Maybe she didn't know what it meant, but Eddie knew. That letter was a contract, not for her career, for her obedience. Kash Patel pivoted the argument to Hollywood's complicity. Names were named. Agencies that had ghosted Eddie suddenly reappeared on internal memos, marking Bella as a high potential. The metadata pointed to several studio executives who were once present at Diddy's infamous parties. They blacklisted me, Eddie said. Then they fast-tracked my daughter. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a setup. Testimony from another victim followed. Anonymous voice altered, but her words echoed Bella's. They said I was born for this. I thought they meant acting. They meant something else. Kash closed the day with a damning statement. What we're dealing with is not merely a predator. We're confronting a cartel of influence masked as mentorship. Murphy glanced at the jury. They sold salvation, but only to those willing to offer something unholy in return. The session adjourned, but the air didn't clear. It hung heavy like the weight of the truth that had just been spoken. The courtroom had become a confessional, each session peeling away layers of power, protection, and silence. But nothing could brace them for what came next. Eddie Murphy returned to the stand. This time he wasn't trembling. He was resolute. I brought more, he began. Not just words, not just theories. I brought the proof. He handed over a second folder, this one larger, heavier. It contained names, correspondence, and transactional records. Most importantly, it included a series of covertly recorded audio files. One tape in particular caught everyone's attention. It began innocently muffled laughter, a clink of glasses. Then a voice, unmistakably Diddy's, said, "They come to us bright-eyed. We polish them, or break them. Depends what we need." The tape stunned the room. A second voice followed a whisper. "And what about Eddie's girl? She'll come around. They always do. If not, there's always the leverage." The word leverage echoed like a thunderclap. Kash Patel played more. There were discussions about media control, about how to ease coverage, how to sweeten reports about young talents being discovered at exclusive events. Names of journalists were dropped, contracts reviewed, endorsement deals sealed, all part of a public image, masking a private horror. The media wasn't just silent, Eddie said. They were active participants. Pam Bondi stood to corroborate the evidence. "We've traced financial links between major news networks and shell companies tied to Diddy's empire. These weren't just blind eyes. These were bought ones." The attention shifted to a third party, an executive producer from a top-tier network, who had attended several white parties. He had once offered Eddie a lucrative comeback deal. That offer vanished once Eddie spoke out the first time. He told me Eddie said, "We all have debts to pay. Some of us just choose to pay with silence." Kash Patel pivoted again, presenting flight records linking Bella Murphy to multiple out-of-state locations under aliases. The events were marked as industry mentoring sessions. All were scheduled around known Diddy events. "We found her name again and again, masked under project codenames," Kash said. The courtroom heard from Bella next. A protected testimony done via closed-circuit video. Her voice was fragile yet clear. "I thought I was there because of my talent. They told me I was lucky. But luck shouldn't come with fear." She described how she had tried to speak up once, but was met with coded threats. One person even handed her a note with a stick figure family sketched in red ink. "It wasn't a warning," Bella said. "It was a promise." The courtroom froze. No one moved. Even Diddy looked away. Pam Bondi leaned into the mic. "This is grooming by design. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as intended for them." Eddie broke down for the first time, wiping tears but holding steady. "My daughter suffered because I said no. That's the cost of speaking out. But the cost of silence, it's too high." Documents introduced next showed hush money transactions, payments labeled as consulting fees or marketing stipends, made to families of at least 5 other minors. Each case followed the same script: promise, exposure, control. The gallery gasped when a slideshow was shown. Blurred faces, masked names, but the patterns were unmistakable. Young talent, rapid rise, silent fall. Kash then called a surprise witness, a former House staff member from Diddy's estate. Hidden behind a screen, she described the hidden rooms, the altered security footage, the protocols for when VIP guests arrived. There were instructions: never ask questions, never look directly, and if they run, lock the gates. Eddie leaned forward. "Bella ran," he whispered. "She tried." By the time Eddie Murphy returned for the final session, the courtroom felt like a cathedral of reckoning. Every word, every testimony, every document had slowly dismantled the facade. Now came the final hammer strike. The first to speak wasn't Eddie, but Bella. In a sealed court session, Bella sat with her attorney and a trauma specialist, her voice faint but unwavering. "I didn't know what I was walking into. It was supposed to be a celebration, but it felt like a trap." She recounted her first white party, the invitation arriving in a glitzy envelope with platinum trim, no sender's name. Her father never saw it. She was told by a mutual friend of the industry it would be a networking mixer. "I believed them," she said. "I wanted to belong." Inside the mansion, she was stripped of her phone, handed a robe, and ushered into a velvet-lit parlor. The laughter sounded rehearsed. The smiles didn't reach anyone's eyes. She recalled how Diddy never introduced himself. He didn't have to. Everyone knew who he was, and they feared him. That night, she said she watched others be led into rooms and come out different. Her own invitation to one of those rooms came with a soft whisper: "You're special. You get to see everything." Bella described how she tried to leave. She even made it as far as the gate before being intercepted by a silent security guard. "He looked at me like I was already lost. I was told, if you leave, your family pays. And then they showed me pictures, my house, my school, my little brothers." She returned. Not just that night, but several more times. Each time the reasons changed, but the fear didn't. Kash Patel presented video captures from the estate's internal surveillance, partially recovered and redacted to protect identities. Bella was seen entering, then exiting, eyes hollow, walking like a ghost. Eddie couldn't stay silent. He stood, breaking court protocol. "Your Honor, she was just a child." The judge allowed him to continue. "She was punished because I refused to kneel. My defiance became her debt." Eddie revealed a set of encrypted drives materials he had been collecting for years. Photos, messages, contracts. And one voice note from Diddy: "Tell Murphy this is what loyalty looks like. Tell him I've got his legacy in my hands." Pam Bondi addressed the court next. "This is no longer just about misconduct. This is about a criminal enterprise leveraging celebrity media and fear to build an empire on silence." She named names, studio heads, former agents, publicists, media executives. Then, to everyone's astonishment, Pam revealed an affidavit from a former FBI liaison, anonymous but verified. It stated that past attempts to investigate these parties had been quietly shut down. Too many important names, the agent noted. The ripple was immediate. The media gallery, once cautious, now erupted. Questions flooded, hashtags trended. Diddy sat unmoved, jaw clenched. A final witness was called, a tech expert from a cloud security firm. He had been part of a covert operation to recover deleted communications from a secure messaging platform used by Diddy's network. What they found confirmed the worst coded language about initiations, lists of targets' payouts, and a directory of influencers used for propaganda. One entry simply read, "Bella, accessed, compliant under stress." Eddie broke down. The jury was silent. Kash stood once more. This wasn't about fame. This was about control, domination disguised as opportunity, and Mr. Murphy risked everything to bring this forward. The courtroom adjourned for a final break. As people filed out, many looked to Bella's image on the screen, a teenager caught in a web woven by giants. When they returned, Eddie gave his final words. "I lost work, yes. I lost friends, opportunities, everything I thought mattered. But the only thing that truly broke me was knowing my silence gave them space. That ends now." He turned to Bella's screen. "I'm sorry, baby. I should have shouted sooner." Then to the jury, what happens next is not about revenge. It's about making sure no one else has to bleed in the dark while the world claps in the light. The judge nodded. Let the truth be entered into the record, completely. Court adjourned, but the echo of the reckoning had only just begun.